My name is Thomas Harlow, and I've been running a small bakery in the heart of our town for the past 15 years. We serve the usual pastries, breads, and cakes, but it's the challah loaves that have always been the most popular, especially among the local Jewish community. I'm not a baker by profession. My late wife, Rachel, was. She was the one with the passion and skill for it, but after she passed, I took over the bakery to keep her dream alive. The regulars who come in every week are like a second family to me. One regular, in particular, stands out. Every Friday, like clockwork, a woman named Mrs. Evelyn Whitaker would come in and order 100 challah loaves, each cut in half. It was an odd request, but I never questioned it. Business is business, after all, and she always paid in cash, in crisp $100 bills. She was an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that always seemed to look right through you. She was polite but reserved, and she never lingered to chat like the other customers. After collecting her order, she'd leave as quickly as she arrived. One Friday, as I was wrapping up her order, curiosity got the better of me. "Mrs. Whitaker," I began cautiously, "may I ask why you need so many challah loaves every week?" She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's for a special gathering," she replied curtly. "A tradition." That was all she offered, and I didn't press further. But the encounter left me uneasy. There was something about her that didn't sit right with me, a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice strange things happening around the bakery. Loaves of bread would go missing, and I'd find odd symbols drawn in flour on the counters in the mornings. I dismissed it as the work of mischievous teenagers, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. One night, after closing up, I decided to follow Mrs. Whitaker. I needed to know where she was taking all that bread. I waited in my car until she arrived, collected her order, and drove off. I trailed her car at a safe distance as she left the town and headed towards the outskirts, where the houses were few and far between. After about half an hour, she turned onto a narrow, unmarked dirt road leading into the woods. I parked my car at the entrance and continued on foot, the darkness of the forest swallowing me whole. The path led to a clearing, where I saw a large, decrepit mansion. The windows were dark, and the air was thick with an unsettling silence. Mrs. Whitaker's car was parked outside. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered through one of the windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, there were people, dozens of them, gathered around a long table covered in candles. They were all chanting in a language I didn't understand. In the center of the table were the challah loaves, arranged in a peculiar pattern. Mrs. Whitaker stood at the head of the table, holding a large, ancient-looking book. She raised her arms, and the chanting grew louder. The air seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. I stumbled back, horrified. This wasn't just some eccentric tradition, it was something far darker. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just witnessed. Were they part of some cult? Was this some kind of ritual? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran back to my car, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The next day, Mrs. Whitaker didn't come to the bakery. Nor did she come the following Friday. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that mansion, but the memory of that night haunted me. Weeks passed, and I noticed a change in my customers. Some of my regulars stopped coming altogether, and those who did seemed distant, almost vacant. It was as if a shadow had fallen over the community. One evening, as I was closing up, I found a note slipped under the door. It was written in the same strange symbols I had seen before, and though I couldn't understand it, I knew it was a warning. I was being watched. Panic set in, and I decided to leave town for a while. I packed my bags and left in the dead of night, not telling anyone where I was going. For months, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't return to the bakery, and eventually, it was sold off. I never heard from Mrs. Whitaker again, and the strange occurrences faded from memory, becoming the stuff of local legend. But I know what I saw was real. There was something sinister at play, something beyond comprehension. To this day, I can't eat halal bread without feeling a chill run down my spine. What was once a simple, comforting food has become a symbol of something dark and disturbing. I don't know what happened to those people or what Mrs. Whitaker was truly involved in, but I fear that some things are better left unknown. My name is John, and I've managed a small, quaint bakery in a sleepy town for the past 10 years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the smell of freshly baked bread in the morning is a staple of the community. The bakery itself is an old building with creaky floors and a history that dates back almost a century. It was always a comforting place, until one fateful day turned it into a scene of horror that I'll never forget. It started like any other day. I arrived at 5 a.m., ready to prepare for the morning rush. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the town was still shrouded in darkness. I was supposed to meet the AM manager, Karen, and our baker, Thomas. As Karen and I entered the store, we immediately sensed something was off. There was no familiar sound of Thomas humming while he worked, and the usual warmth from the ovens was absent. Karen and I exchanged worried glances and headed to the back. There was no sign of Thomas. A quick call to his phone went straight to voicemail. No message, no warning, Thomas had simply vanished. Panic began to set in, but we couldn't afford to shut down the bakery. Karen called in 2 backup bakers, but they wouldn't arrive for another hour. We decided to start prepping what we could. As we worked in the silence of the early morning, the eerie stillness of the bakery began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak and groan of the old building made my heart race. An hour later, the backup bakers, Mike and Sarah, finally arrived. I felt a slight relief, but it was short-lived. As they started their work, I decided to check the storage room for supplies. The moment I opened the door, a wave of dread washed over me. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. The light flickered, casting long, sinister shadows across the walls. I found the supplies quickly and was about to leave when something caught my eye. In the far corner, hidden behind some flour sacks, was an old, dusty journal. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages yellowed with age. I opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to the original owner of the bakery, a man named Harold Grimes. Harold wrote about his love for baking, but as I read further, the entries took a dark turn. He spoke of hearing whispers in the bakery at night, seeing shadows move on their own, and feeling an unrelenting coldness that chilled him to the bone. One entry stood out, December 13th, 1923. The voices are getting louder. They tell me to bake, to feed them. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I fear what will happen if I do as they ask. My hands trembled as I read those words. I suddenly remembered today's date, December 13th. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I quickly closed the journal and shoved it back behind the flour sacks. I needed to tell Karen. I rushed back to the front, but before I could speak, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the bakery. It was Sarah. Karen, Mike, and I ran to the kitchen to find Sarah standing there, pale and shaking, pointing at the oven. Inside, through the oven's glass door, we saw what had terrified her. The dough Mike had just placed inside had formed a grotesque face, its eyes staring blankly, mouth open in a silent scream. The temperature gauge on the oven was spinning wildly, despite the fact that we hadn't even turned it on yet. Karen tried to reassure everyone, but her voice quivered with fear. "It's just a coincidence," she said, but none of us believed her. We were all too terrified. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The bakery was filled with an unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of our heavy breathing. I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight, and when I turned it on, I nearly dropped it in shock. Standing in the doorway was a shadowy figure, tall and menacing, its eyes glowing a faint red. It started moving towards us, slowly at first, then faster. We bolted towards the front door, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Desperate, we huddled together, praying for the nightmare to end. The figure reached us, and just as it seemed we would be engulfed in darkness, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. We didn't talk much after that. The backup bakers left, refusing to ever return, and Karen and I sat in the front, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, I closed the bakery for the day and called the police to report Thomas missing. The police found no trace of him, and his disappearance remains a mystery to this day. I still manage the bakery, but I never stay past dark, and I always keep Harold's journal close. The whispers haven't stopped, and the coldness still lingers, reminding me of that terrifying day. I often wonder if the bakery demands more than just our labor, if it requires a sacrifice to keep the whispers at bay. My name is Lucas, and I once worked the night shift at a quaint bakery in a small town in southern Brazil. I was 30 years old at the time, and although my job was simple, cleaning up after hours and prepping for the next day, what happened during those nights would haunt me forever. It all started on a chilly, rainy evening in late October. The bakery was nestled in a quiet, unassuming part of town, a place where everything seemed normal until it wasn't. For the first few months, my shifts were uneventful, marked only by the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the occasional flicker of the old neon sign outside. But things took a dark turn one stormy night. I had just finished mopping the floors when I heard a strange noise coming from the storage room in the back. The sound was subtle but persistent, like something or someone scratching against the walls. My curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. As I approached the storage room, the noise stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine but shrugged it off, attributing it to the wind or perhaps my imagination. When I entered the room, everything seemed in order, except for an old, dusty cabinet that I had never paid much attention to. The cabinet was slightly ajar, and I noticed that the flour bags on the top shelf had been disturbed. As I was about to close it, a sudden gust of wind slammed the cabinet door shut. I jumped, cursing under my breath, and quickly decided it was best to finish my tasks and leave early. The next night, something even more unsettling happened. As I was cleaning, I heard my name being whispered from the shadows. It was a soft, barely audible voice that seemed to come from nowhere. My heart raced, and I tried to rationalize it as the stress of the job playing tricks on me. I scanned the bakery, but there was no one there. Later that week, I was working late when I decided to check the storage room again. The cabinet that had previously been slightly open was now wide open, and a peculiar smell of decay filled the room. I approached the cabinet and noticed something strange, an old, yellowed newspaper tucked away behind the shelves. The date on the newspaper was from 1984, and the headline caught my eye: "Local baker found dead in his shop, mystery surrounds tragic death." The article detailed the death of a baker named Marcos Pereira, who had owned the very bakery where I now worked. According to the report, Marcos had been found hanging from the ceiling of his shop in a gruesome suicide. His death was marked by an unusual detail. The bakery had been left in disarray, with flour scattered everywhere, as if he had tried to leave a final message. Shaken, I read further and discovered that witnesses had reported strange occurrences in the bakery leading up to Marcos's death. People claimed they heard whispers and saw shadows moving on their own. It seemed that Marcos's death was not just a tragic event, but possibly the culmination of something more sinister. That night, the atmosphere in the bakery grew increasingly oppressive. I could feel a constant presence, a sense of being watched. The following nights were filled with unsettling noises, footsteps in the empty halls and muffled whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One evening, as I was closing up, the power went out. The darkness was complete, suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of someone, or something, moving in the shadows. The flashlight I used flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. Then, I saw it, a figure in the darkness, barely visible, moving towards me with a deliberate slowness. My breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to come closer and closer until it was almost upon me. In a blind panic, I sprinted to the front door, fumbling with the lock, and escaped into the night. The next day, I reported everything to my supervisor, but he dismissed my concerns, attributing them to stress. Determined to prove I wasn't just imagining things, I reviewed the security footage, only to find that the cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the times of the disturbances. The recordings were corrupted, leaving nothing but static. Unable to endure the torment any longer, I resigned and never returned. The bakery was eventually closed down, its reputation marred by the rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences. I learned later that the building was sold and renovated, but no one ever seemed to stay there for long. The haunting stories persisted, and the ghost of Marcos Pereira seemed to remain a dark shadow over the place. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something in that bakery was far beyond the normal, a chilling reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the echoes of something much darker, waiting for the next person to uncover its secrets.